Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to this afternoon's session on a mindfulness approach to educator wellness, developing acceptance skills and strengthening commitment to act. We're very happy to have you with us today and have Dr. Imad Zaheer with us as well. Hopefully those of you who are with us have been able to join some of our other previous sessions. But if this is the first session you're joining, welcome. We're happy to have you. Just going to start with just a couple housekeeping items, reminders to please feel free to use the chat function to engage with the panelists and with your peers. Dr. Zaheer may also ask some questions in which he invites you to comment in the chat box. So please feel free to do that. Remember that you have control over who can see what you type in the chat. So if you want just the presenter and the panelists to see your comments, you can leave it as all panelists. I think that's the default. If you would like your fellow attendees to be able to see your comment, please click on the drop-down arrow next to the 2 in the chat box and select all panelists and all attendees. That way your fellow attendees will be able to see your comment as well. If you have questions for Dr. Zaheer, please put them in the Q&A box using the Q&A function. And at the end of the presentation, we'll save some time for Dr. Zaheer to respond to your questions. I think that's most of what I wanted to remind you. I'll introduce Dr. Zaheer. We're very happy to have Dr. Imad Zaheer with us. He's an assistant professor of school psychology in the Department of Psychology at St. John's University. He's a pediatric school psychologist and has worked on numerous projects in clinics, hospitals, and public and alternative school settings that involve direct and indirect services across individual, group, classroom, and systems levels. His areas of interest are in developing assessments and interventions for children with emotional and behavioral challenges and creating comprehensive school-based prevention programs by integrating school mental health, social emotional learning, and school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports. For his work in these areas, he was awarded the Council for Exceptional Children's Professional Performance Award in 2019. Additionally, Dr. Zaheer sits on the steering committee for the national group Family School Community Alliance, which is an organization dedicated to creating robust collaboration and engagement across schools and family and community settings. Additionally, Dr. Zaheer is the co-founder of the Nurturing Environments Institute. We're very happy he's with us today, and we look to you to close all of us out on a positive note about how we can try to spend a little bit more time taking care of ourselves in what we know is a very stressful time. So thank you, Dr. Zaheer.
Great, and thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this session. I just want to check if my voice is coming through. I think it is. Okay, perfect. So I'm very excited, and I think this is a topic that even before the pandemic was, I think, becoming something that I was increasingly asked to talk about. And I think it can't possibly be more important at this point in our time. So usually I would just call this stress management or relaxation activities. But I'm going to try to take a little bit of a different approach today. And the mindfulness approach to educator wellness, especially through acceptance skills and strengthening our commitments, I hope provides you with a different perspective on stress than maybe some previous trainings that you've attended. And I always start off kind of with a joke that, I'm not going to be able to get rid of your stress by the end of this workshop, or even give you tools that you will leave here being able to better, reducing your stress. But what I'm hoping to be able to do is, one, help you get a better understanding of what stress is. And importantly, how do we relate to stress better? And I always ask educators to relate to their own experiences and ask themselves, have you ever been to a stress workshop that actually made your stress go away? It's very rare that I get even one person that says yes. Most of the time it's something that's very relaxing in the moment. But then when we leave the room, when we go back to our classrooms or at home, all that stress comes right back in. So what I'm hoping to do is give you some skills that you can carry with you and even be more successful when you're experiencing those stressful situations. And I think this is, again, particularly important nowadays because we can't really escape the bigger stressors that are coming at us in life. So I'm going to get started. The one thing I just want to mention on the top is that at some point, we will be just doing an activity. So if you wanted to get a paper and a pencil or a pen, you can actually do the activity in front of you, but we'll be also doing it together on the screen here. Okay, so to get started, I like to just start off with a little bit of a background on stress. I can imagine a lot of us right now feel like our zebra friend here, where we might be losing our stripes with the amount of stress that we're facing. And I always like to start off with the story of the zebra and stress because it's something that is very relatable to us, believe it or not. We have almost the same exact stress system as a zebra does. And our stress response system, just like the zebra, largely evolved to get away from this guy. Right? So if we have a lion chasing us, or if the zebra has a lion chasing them, that's the only problem that exists, right? And the only stress that we have is how do we get away from this lion, right? So we don't get eaten in that situation. And just like the zebra's biology, which is geared around how do I get away, how do I fight this lion away from me, our stress response system is almost exactly the same. So when we're in stressful situations, we're likely to also be responding as if there's a lion in the room. Now, if you happen to live around lions and there actually is a lion in the room, this is a wonderful system to have. You're going to have blood going through your legs. You're going to feel a lot of energy, and you're probably going to run for your life. Unfortunately, as humans, we can also have other stressors. So we can have thoughts and feelings and symbolic stressors that are equal to the lion, but not things that we can run away from. And I'm sure all of us have experiences at some point where we're very, very stressed out about a deadline. Right now, I can imagine a lot of us are stressed about safety and logistics, what everything is going to look like when we're going back into schools. And we're likely to be having a lot of these different thoughts. I know I am definitely having a lot of these thoughts of how do I teach online? What if I fail? How do I manage home and work life while at home? And unfortunately for us, the way our stress response system is set up is it can't tell the difference between a lion and having these stressful thoughts. So we end up in a situation where, unlike a real lion and a zebra, where if the zebra gets away from the lion, it goes on to live its wonderful life, we can't really get away from our thoughts, right? And I'm sure a lot of us have also had this experience where we lay in bed, and no matter how much we try to relax, our brain is racing with these different thoughts. Our body is very awake in that moment. And there's nothing we can really do to get rid of that thought from coming through and stressing us out in that situation. And there might be a whole variety of different thoughts, whether it's related to the current events, whether it's even related to the COVID or just general stress that we're experiencing. I imagine a lot of us have been experiencing stress from even before a lot of the pandemic hit. So it could just exacerbate the stresses that we were already feeling. So all these thoughts are going to be with us, and that's going to trigger our biology in somewhat of a simple way, right? And again, our body really can't tell that difference. So I always think we might be having a thought of, when will this quarantine end? And our body is going to be thinking lion, right? And then that's the only function it has. So we're going to start to see increased blood flow in the legs, which is not helpful in answering the question of when will the quarantine end. We're going to have increased heart rate, and we're going to have shutting down digestion. I can tell you right now that I'm a very nervous presenter. So as soon as I start presenting, my heart is going up. I have blood flowing through my legs. My mouth is turning dry. These are not helpful things for me to present, but they're wonderful things to get away from a lion. So this is kind of the system that we're given, right? So this is our bodies. This is how our body is going to respond to stress. And this is why I'm going to try to walk you through a series of strategies that can help us not get rid of this stress system, because we can't. And it will come in handy if we do encounter a lion. But also, how do we remain more functional? How do we make sure that we use the system in a way that's going to help us rather than something that can get us into really harmful situations? So to do that, I'm going to introduce an approach called acceptance and commitment training. It's also a therapy, so sometimes it's called acceptance and commitment therapy. But since we're not doing therapy today, we're just doing training, so I'm going to stick to this one. And this is really, in terms of the acceptance piece, is to help us relate to our own experiences in a more flexible way. So if we are having a lot of those thoughts, a lot of those strong feelings, how can we relate to those feelings in a more flexible way? And then how do we use that flexibility to move towards the things that are important for us in life? And then the last component here is practice. And the practice piece is a really important one because, as I was mentioning earlier, chances are, even if you do the exercise here today, it's not going to be something that's going to just make it magically better. But it is something that we have to practice on a regular basis. I often compare it to running. So if we want to get, if we've never run before, but we want to get better at running, we have to do it every day, right? And if we stop running for a month, we're going to get worse at running. So this is something that is a training and a practice that we can make as part of our everyday practice, and something that we can continue to do and get better at. But the less we do of it, we're also going to go backwards, right? And we'll lose that kind of flexibility the less we actually practice it in this situation. However, I'm aware that we probably don't have a huge amount of time during our day to practice. So you'll see, I'll give you some strategies of how you can do it very briefly, all the way down to maybe a minute of your day, but something to kind of keep you going every single day. So what I'm going to do next is our activity, which will actually walk you through this approach. And it's actually called the Ack Matrix. And this is where your paper and pencil will come in handy. So I'm going to actually show you the diagram for this activity. And it's a simple plus sign. It doesn't have to be a dotted line, but on the horizontal line, if you can draw arrows pointing in both directions, in the left and the right. So if you do have a piece of paper in front of you, if you want to, you can draw this out, and you can work privately in front of you. But in a moment, I'll be asking you to also participate as a group. So if you feel comfortable, we'll have you participate through the chat. Okay, so what I'm going to do is quickly just explain this diagram before we get started. And so the first thing I want you to notice, and if you want to write it down on the top, we're going to put our 5 senses. And this is going to indicate that the top part of our diagram here is the world of our actions, or sometimes I'll call this our outside view. So these are the things that we can sense through our 5 senses. So that's going to be the top 2 squares. And to get a better sense of this, I'm actually going to pause here and just do a mini exercise of getting in touch with our 5 senses right now, and just kind of bringing ourselves into the moment by doing a very, very quick mindfulness exercise. And again, this is something you can do at your desk. If there's parts of it that are difficult, that's okay. You can skip individual parts, but we're just going to quickly walk through our 5 senses. And the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to find 5 things that you can see in your current environment. It could be anything around you. I'm noticing my computer. I can see my phone here. I have old erasers on the desk for some reason, so I'm noticing those. But see if you can find 5 things in your environment that you can just see. Okay, and the next one, we're going to look to see if there's 4 things that we can touch in our environment. So I can touch my desk over here. I can even feel the clothing, my shirt that I'm wearing. I'm sitting barefoot, so I can feel the carpet on my feet. So it could be anything in your environment, the 4 things you can easily touch in your current setting. Okay, and then next, we're going to look to see if there's 3 things we can hear in our environment. This might be a little bit harder depending on where you are, but you can count my voice as one of the things you might be hearing. You can make sounds if you want to. You can tap something. Let's see if you can find 3 things you can hear. Okay. And then the next one, this might be even a little bit harder. We want to see if there's 2 things we can smell in our environment. I'm just finishing up lunch, so I can still smell the food that we were making. But there might be just other smells in your environment. So see if there's 2 things you can smell. And then finally, for our last sense, see if there's 1 thing we can taste. Now we're lucky we're doing this after lunch, so hopefully you all had lunch and you probably have a little bit of taste left from what you were eating. I just had some coffee, so I can taste it in my mouth. Let's see if there's one thing you can taste in your mouth. Okay. So hopefully that was enough time, and hopefully even if you weren't able to do all of them, you were able to get at least one or two of the senses, and that's just to bring us a little bit into the mind of thinking about our five senses on this diagram on the top. It's also just a great exercise to bring ourselves into the moment if we're running around, if we're stressed, or our mind is everywhere. But in this case, it's just helping us also understand the top of this diagram of our five senses. Next, what we're going to do is put mind at the bottom of this diagram. And this is going to signal to us that on the bottom here, this is going to be the world of our mind. And sometimes I'll call this the inside view. And this is really all the things that only we can notice internal to us, as opposed to something that other people may be able to notice on the outside view for us. And once we do that, I just want you to notice the difference between these two. And you can even do this in terms of something you might be looking at or using one of your five senses to get to know, versus what it feels like when you're experiencing that item or image inside of your mind. And we just want to kind of notice the difference between the two. Okay. And then next, what we're going to do is we're going to go left to right now. So on the left side, we're going to actually put away on top of our line here. And this is going to indicate that on the left side, we're going to be looking at things that we want to move away from or things that we want to get away from. So I can certainly think we all probably want to get away from this quarantine at some point, and even more so get away from the virus, and all the other, maybe some other things that are stressing us out. But all the things that we might want to get away from, things that make us move away in these situations. And then on the other side, we're going to write towards on the line. And this is going to indicate the things that we want to move towards, or something that we want to get closer to. So again, I'm going to keep using the quarantine as an example, but I'm sure we're all looking forward to the time when we can all go back to some form of normal, in terms of the quarantine ending and being back in person. But again, it could be anything in your life that you would want to move towards or get closer to. And just like we did with the five senses in the mind, we just want to notice the difference. And you can even take a second to think of examples of things you want to move away from and how that feels, and then also things that you want to move towards and how that feels different when we're moving towards something versus moving away from something. I sometimes use the example that it could even be the same exact thing. And I could be doing something, a project that I just have to do and I want to get it over with. So I'm just trying to get it off my table. I want to get rid of it. I just want to be done with it. And then there's other projects that I'm really interested in and I want to do them. And I find myself wanting to move towards them or work on them. So you can think of your own examples of things that you want to move away from and then things that you might want to move towards. Okay. So that's everything you would need on your diagram. So if you haven't been able to copy this down, it's actually going to be up on the screen. But once we have all of this, we can actually start our activity. What I'm going to do here is actually switch over to my iPad over here so we can start writing. Oops. Okay. So we do have, hopefully you can see this here on the iPad. It's the same diagram we were just working with. But usually we do this in front of you, either on a board or on a piece of paper. So this is our high-tech version of this. And what we're going to do now that we have this in terms of our five senses in the mind and things we want to move away from and move towards, now we're going to ask some questions in this. So first thing we're going to do is go down to our mind and moving towards. And I'm going to ask our first question here, and that is, what is important to you? And this is where you can go into the chat and actually start writing things down. I always like to put mine up here first, my cats, just to get in there before the dog lovers. Okay, great. I can see some of the responses here. Family, friends.
We've also got health, and it looks like we do have some dog lovers out there.
Yeah. There's always a few.
Safety and security,
Safety.
peace of mind, clean air, creating art, sleep,
Air.
job. They're going quickly here. Gardening.
Yeah. Joy, gardening.
Mm-hmm. Helping others, wellness, rest, yoga.
Helping others. Got yoga. These are great. Self-care. So this looks very much like my own list. Spirituality.
We've got sun, which maybe some areas of the country are getting a little too much of these days. Security.
Security. We're definitely getting a lot more of it, at least in terms of getting to see it because of the pandemic for me.
That's right.
So open-mindedness. Self-regulation.
You also see belonging and accountability,
Peace.
community, connection.
Yeah.
There's a baker out there.
So baking.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. I think I saw accountability was one of those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Accountability. Oops. So time to self. I think we have job on there.
Mm-hmm. Knitting and creating things.
Yeah, creating. You can tell my handwriting is going down here. Hunting and fishing. A lot of good hobbies.
Financial security. Meditating.
Seeing compassion.
Mm-hmm. Oh, we just had a couple adventure came up a couple times.
Adventure.
And love.
Love. Move up here for extra space. These are all great. I think we have compassion. Trying to see if we justice, self-love, intimacy, exercise. Great. It looks like we'll put fairness on here. Laughter. These are wonderful. These are actually, I'm seeing a lot of new varieties of the ones that I typically get. So these are all wonderful responses. We have justice, all that inequality. We have Tai Chi. Nature. Sanity. It's probably more important nowadays than before. Horses. Another good one. Communication. Closeness. Cooking. Oh, these are wonderful. So what I'm gonna do, just because we're running out of space over here, if I see any more coming out, I'll try to fit them in there. But just for space purposes, I'm gonna start to slide over into one of our other boxes here. So let's just zoom out. And now what we're gonna do is, while we stay within our mind, we're gonna move over to the away side. And now I'm gonna just shift the question over to what shows up inside our mind that moves us away. And here again, I'll put mine on here, which I'm sure a lot of you may share, is anxiety. So these could be thoughts, emotions, sensations. Um, right? Anger, good one. Fear of change. Oops.
These are coming in fast.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Challenging my writing speed
Mm-hmm.
here. That's great though. They got a lot of people, a lot of things coming in. Um, Some of these
Lack
I'm
of,
seeing are, I'm going to translate them. So lack of rest might be showing up as tired internally. Lack of control might be feeling not in control. So I'm just trying to kind of keep it within how is this showing up and maybe inside of our mind.
we
Unmotivated,
have lack of in-person connection, which maybe is loneliness.
hopefulness, hopelessness. Maybe some withdrawal. Taking things personally. So distrust might be showing up.
We have worry.
Worry.
I see shoulds. I don't know if you want to try and translate that.
Shoulds are a big category. We might
Okay.
thoughts of all the different shoulds. We should be doing this. We should be doing that. We should be better. And guilt. So self-talk. I apologize if I'm missing some of these. I'm just trying to grab most of them. Failure. So maybe this could even be a memory. I know whenever I'm doing something new or old, even memories of past failures often show up. It could even be physical health issues that are showing up. So it might be pain. So toxic narratives. So these could be thoughts that are running through our mind. Are
We've
there
got
other ones that I've missed?
burnout.
Burnout,
Mm-hmm.
sadness.
Do you have overwhelmed?
I don't think I have that yet, but get overwhelmed.
Shame.
Shame is a good one. And we have guilt.
Boredom.
Boredom.
Emptiness.
Oh, that's a good one.
Mm-hmm.
Something I can relate to during this kind of pandemic. Vulnerable.
Restlessness.
Restlessness. I have one of the lines on here is dread.
Mm-hmm.
regret.
I've seen a couple procrastination.
Do we have that already, or pro? And this again could be many things. It could just be not wanting to do anything. Oops. Hold on 1 second. Sorry about that.
Looks like we've got discombobulated.
Discombobulated. This is going to
Great
check
word.
my spelling. This is where I'm certainly feeling a lot of nervousness writing and spelling in front of teachers and educators. Yep. So these are, I think I see a question on there. So right now we're listing only the things that are showing up in our mind. So we're still on the bottom of the diagram, but we are going to actually start to transition over to actions. I think put anger over here. And again, just for space and time purposes, we're going to try to move forward. The one thing I will put on here is one of my favorites, which I think a lot of us may experience or even sometimes is a little bit more hidden, is even excitement. And sometimes, depending on what the excitement is for or which in the moment, it can actually be something that at least moves me away. If I'm too excited about something, even though it's a positive thing, it's still something that might be in the wrong direction. So sometimes that itself can be something that shows up that moves me away. I had more along the lines of maybe obsession. I see too intense. Great, wonderful. These are wonderful additions to our list. I'm just going to zoom out here to again show that we're still on the bottom of this diagram. And now what I'm going to do is move up here and ask our questions at the top of the diagram. So this is where we're getting into the outside view. And now we're going to really look at our actions. So the question up here is going to be, what actions move us away from those things that we find important? So same thing here, if you can think of it. And again, I'll put mine on here first. Say a fancy word for procrastination is Netflix. See, overscheduling. Sickness. Right. I think some with social media here. I'm not asking for help. Physical distance. So I'll just keep this with, I'm seeing some that are more either feelings or things that might be happening to us. So I think one, try to see how our actions might be moving us away in those situations. So overcommitting. A lot of social media. I can relate to that. Avoidance is a big one. I'm going to put it right here next to Netflix. A lot of Hulu on here too. Maybe the news. Yep, I see lack of trust. I believe we have that down on the bottom part. Going to bed late. I'm guilty of that. I blame the NBA in the playoffs. See, stuck in indecision. see, poor balance of home and work. Are there any other ones that I'm missing? They're going by really fast. Nope, not saying no.
There's poor diet.
Diet.
I don't think we have that. Chores.
Chores. I saw not prioritizing.
Mm-hmm.
A good one.
Not setting boundaries.
Yep.
Arguments, yeah.
Not setting boundaries. Yep, we got too much news on here.
Mm-hmm.
Giving up, so maybe being inactive. And again, this feels a lot like the list I would make for myself. So I can see a lot of these things that I'm also finding myself engaging in. Okay, so maybe see you need to be always right. Maybe put that under arguments. I often call that the writing reflex. You want to be right all the time. So I see some urges that are being listed, so I'm just going to put that in the mind. So urges to solve. I can relate to that too. Getting a lot of requests to solve people's problems or even other people's emotions. Any other actions that we're finding ourselves taking that are moving us away from those things that are important to us? Okay, great. So we're gonna move over to our last square. And again, we're gonna stay on the top here. So we're still gonna be looking at our actions. And by now you can probably guess what our last question is, which is what actions are moving us towards what's important to us. So you can put all different answers over here. Positive feedback. Planning. Serving others. Being creative. Calling friends is a good one. Hiking. Just went hiking this past Saturday. I'll put following schedule next to the scheduling. Laughing. Family support. Coloring is one of my favorites. Seeing virtual church. Sleep. Another one of my favorites.
I see you went right by the playing with dogs because you're a cat person.
Well, you know, put both of them down. Playing with dogs and cats.
Meditation and reading.
Meditation and reading. I hear an ice cream truck that could be on.
Oh, that's outside my window.
Calling mom. Talking to friends. Thai food. Chasing ice cream trucks. Reading Bible. British comedy. Reading books. What's it? Healthy diet.
I see going to Disney.
Time.
British comedies.
Disney. We have British comedy.
Oh, okay.
I'm probably missing a few of those. I apologize if I'm not able to get everybody. I think planning we have. We can add for the future. Oops. Which is a good one, even though right now it might not feel like we have the luxury of planning. I'm just attempting. Sorry, go ahead.
Hot shower or bath?
Shower. Gratitude journal. Setting boundaries. Praying. I have one of mine's. One thing that me and my partner have been doing is just taking walks. And that's like one of the only constants we have, but it's, unless it's raining, but photo journaling. Okay, so I think we're just about out of space here. I see some taking vacations. We have talking to friends. We do a mood journal. Spreading love. Sipping counseling. Okay, I think just for space reasons, I'm gonna have to stop there. My handwriting was put music on here. Get it here. So I'm just gonna zoom out here just to kind of see our full diagram here. So we've kind of managed to fill in this space. And just to take a notice that we have an amazing list here, and probably didn't even get close to capturing everybody's responses. So this is wonderful. I can say easily this is probably the largest list this activity's created. But interestingly enough, especially for what's important to you, that list almost never changes. It's almost always the same, no matter who I'm doing this activity with, in terms of what are some of those core things that we all find important in our life. And I always give the one exception, which is first graders, which is the youngest group I've done this with, where there was a lot of Barbies and trucks that were important to them. But even them, if you ask them enough follow-up questions, we got a lot of moms and friends. So it's something to just take a notice of just even how many of those things that we might have in common. And even on the side of the away moves that we might be making, whether that's internal to us or external to us, I would not be surprised if a lot of us share some of those things that are showing up inside, as well as some of the actions that we end up taking, whether that's away or moving towards those things that are important to us. But one other thing I wanted to quickly point out was that we might also find ourselves in certain situations where we start to feel something, maybe even something like guilt, and that actually leads to things like arguments. And we find that sometimes the things that are showing up inside of us are actually triggering some of those actions that we're taking to move away, or even the opposite, where we get into an argument and we feel guilty as a result of it. And we can find ourselves almost even in a loop over here of things that are either showing up inside or actions we're taking that lead to things that are going to show up inside of us. And we can easily find ourselves, depending on the situation, in a spiral where we get stuck in the situation where, you know, our guilt leads to arguments, or our arguments lead to guilt. But we find ourselves stuck or trapped in this situation on the left side of this diagram. And one of the parts of this activity is to really just help us notice in our own lives when we're stuck in some of these cycles. It's not meant to be judgmental. I can tell you I get stuck in these cycles all the time. It's part of being human. A lot of my cycles often involve Netflix and feelings of going down to feel anxiety. And the more I watch Netflix and procrastinate, turns out it's not a great way to get rid of the anxiety. So I watch more Netflix, and I can find myself getting overly stuck in that cycle and, you know, not attending to other parts of my life. And what we want to be able to do is take a mindful approach and really remind ourselves of what's important here, and move towards those actions. But importantly, and going back to what I said in the beginning, chances are we're not going to be able to live a life where these things showing up inside are things that we can get rid of. So feelings of anxiety, tiredness, frustration. And what we want to be able to do is when these things show up, noticing that these things are showing up. So going to our noticing in the center here. And as we notice that this is happening, also noticing that we have a choice. We can still choose to take an action that moves us towards, even if some of these things internally to us are showing up that maybe in the past have sent us into this loop. So we might notice that guilt is showing up in a particular situation as it has in the past. And we might even notice that we're starting an argument in that situation. So if we're able to notice that in the moment, we can also start to shift our behavior over to the things that might move us towards what we find important. So I think there was a lot of mention of relationships and family and friends. And so if we're having an argument with someone we care about, that might be a time to notice that we're in that argument. It might be noticing that we have a lot of anger or frustration, and then looking to see what are some actions we can take in this moment that's going to help us move towards what's important to us. So at the basic level, that's actually our whole exercise. And if you've done mindfulness before formal meditation, this is another way to do it, but on a piece of paper. So if you're not maybe fond of formal meditation, this is really to still bring you into the moment and bring you into what you're noticing internally as well as externally. And even just doing this over and over again without actually doing any kind of other additional strategy can help you become better at noticing. I've done this with students, and I do this with myself as well. And sometimes I see this activity visually in my head. I've had students actually draw it on the beach, where they just draw a plus sign, and then they take a picture and send it to me. And I'm not entirely sure how many times they're actually sitting down and writing all this, but it's something that sticks with them in terms of a way of looking at their experience. So I'm actually going to just go back to our slides here, and I'll take a picture of this and send this afterwards, so you have our product here. Let me share back my screen. So that's the initial part of our activity. There's obviously a lot more in terms of what we can do. So just as a quick review, once we have this diagram set up, we can start to sort our experiences across this diagram by asking ourselves these questions, or others with us, of what do we value or what's important to us. What are some stuff that shows up inside of us that moves us away from what we value? So it could be our thoughts, our feelings, memories, sometimes even sensations. And then asking what actions are moving us away from what we value, and then also what are some actions that are moving us towards what we value. And the more you do this activity, the more you might start to notice that there's certain places where you find yourself getting into a cycle, or getting into something that I call these traps, where we find ourselves in a very sticky situation. And it's usually related to the things that we actually find important. So I imagine to some extent, we all have the value of work ethic and being responsible, but given overwhelming levels of stress and anxiety, it's going to be a lot more tempting to hit that snooze alarm, getting up late. And again, that's actually a very natural response. I'm not going to say I've never hit a snooze alarm or been late to getting up in the morning, but it's something that we can find ourselves getting increasingly trapped in, especially in the times that we're living in, where there's a lot more stress than we normally would be experiencing. And what we want to be able to do as we notice this is maybe even noticing from the beginning of what our values are in this situation, finding ways to start shifting our actions towards things that are going to move us towards what we find important. So maybe this is getting up on time, if that means setting 2 alarms, or finding other ways to get up in the morning, finishing important tasks, keeping our commitments. So whatever that looks like for us in our life, finding ways to notice that we might be getting stuck in different cycles. And even if we're facing some of those things that are showing up inside, by noticing them, we can at least put a little bit of our distance where it allows us to choose which action we're going to take in that situation. So as a diagram, I often just give this very simplified version of where we might be getting stuck and how we can move towards our values. But there's a lot of different examples depending on your personal situation. So, depending on what you put down here in terms of what you value, I can think of in our current situation, we probably all value our safety and our health, but we also probably value a lot of our personal connection. I know when I'm feeling stressed, some of the best things that help me is being around the people that I love. But in our current situation, we've noticed that a lot of people that are feeling that stress and anxiety over COVID tend to want to go be with the people that they are probably better off distancing from. So I know early on in the pandemic, we saw a lot of people, especially I think in like New York City, that were going out to parks with their friends as a way to combat their stress. But it's probably not moving them towards their value of safety and health in those situations. So even in a situation like that, where it might require some creativity, we can find other ways to connect, setting up some online interactions, or other ways that we can see each other, maybe from a distance in a safe way. But just noticing that sometimes if we're in a situation where the stress and anxiety is moving us maybe in a less helpful direction, how can we notice that we're doing that and then start to shift towards something that's going to be more helpful? I know I did this personally myself. We actually did some online painting classes or met family members through Windows, but we found other ways to be able to connecting with others without sacrificing our safety or health. We can even think of issues of social justice, which is, again, another thing that nationally and even internationally might be on our minds. And we might be feeling a lot of sadness, anger, frustration. I know we had a lot of people saying distrust, toxic narratives, and we might have all these things happening. And I can tell you for myself, my reaction to that was turning off the TV and the media, playing video games I wasn't even interested in. But that was a great way to try to suppress a lot of my sadness and anger. And then even just keeping myself busy with work, right? So once I started to recognize this cycle, I started to notice that I can also take other actions. So whether that's protesting, for me, working at a university, looking to see how do we change some of the rules and structures at university settings, and other strategies that I might have within my capability of enacting change. So depending on, again, what your situation is and what your values are, it's really a personal matter of looking at your own experiences and noticing where you might be getting stuck, and then also shifting over to the things that might actually be able to help you commit to actions that are going to move you towards what you value. So oftentimes I'll also just give somewhat of a caveat though, when doing this activity. We're very, very good at taking an activity like this and making it another way for us to become very judgmental about our own experience. And one of the best ways of doing this activity is really practicing it with a level of self-compassion. So even if we're looking at our away moves, I often see these as moves that are going to be relieving for us. So they're a move towards relief. So if we're feeling very stressed out, it's a very natural thing to do to go watch TV or do something fun that's going to help us get some relief from the stressful situation. But on the other side, we have long-term satisfaction and contentment. And that's ultimately the thing that we might want to move towards, but also giving ourselves enough compassion to recognize that as human beings, we're always going to be moving in both directions. We're always going to need a break. We're always going to maybe even need to take a two steps back before we start taking some steps towards that long-term contentment in our life. And I think that's more important now than ever because of the extra stress we're feeling. So sometimes on the left side here, I'll say this relief is oftentimes our survival mechanism when we're really under an enormous amount of stress. Netflix might be the best thing you can do for yourself in that moment, even if it is not part of some broader value you have in life. In that moment, that might be helpful for your relief or survival. And on the other side, it's the things that are very vital for us, right? Family, friends, relationships, bigger things that, we want to move towards and in the long term, but not necessarily in 100% of the time. So as educators, I think there's always a lot of stress. We can find ourselves across the map. And I often recommend that you try to find your own balance and even be flexible with this. So, in a normal circumstance, you might be doing 20% of move towards relief and 80% towards contentment. But in the current situation, it might be closer to 40 and 60. where 40% of your moves are towards relief and 60% are towards that long-term contentment. So this can even change over time depending on what's happening. I know for myself, it dropped radically when all this quarantine happened, and I had to really shift over towards finding immediate relief that was going to help me get through certain situations. And as I get better and better at handling some of the stressors, I'm starting to move back towards those long-term contentment and satisfaction. But that's likely to change depending on how the situation is around me. So the thing that we really try to emphasize with this activity is that flexibility is key, and specifically psychological flexibility. None of these experiences are meant to be wrong or bad, but noticing and getting better at noticing in a mindful way of what are our experiences, what are those things that are important to us. And if we notice things are a way that we maybe prefer they're not, shifting our actions to make it more appropriate for whatever our life is calling for in these different situations. And sometimes, depending on how you like to do some of these activities, some people like more concrete ways of doing this. And what I found really helpful sometimes is creating small lists. So I'll often ask myself, how will I remind myself of values? And I might take my list and I'll turn it down into maybe 3 core things, right? So if I'm thinking about all the relationships and people and even cats in my life, I might bring that down to 1 word of maybe love, or maybe relationships. And then I'm going to find ways to remind myself of my values. I often try to do this early in the day to get up in the day and remind myself of what are some of those things that are important to me. On the lower left side, I might do something like a thought or emotion journal. So maybe periodically throughout the day, I might write down what I'm noticing is coming up for me, whether they're thoughts or feelings or just how my body feels in any given moment. And then as I go throughout my days or my weeks, I often write down different goals I have. So what are some away moves that I'm trying to reduce? I could tell you right now, Netflix is top of that list. And then what are some toward moves that I'm trying to increase, no matter what the situation is. I usually don't have 5 of them. I usually pick 1. I think 1 is hard enough. So 1 thing I'm trying to reduce and 1 thing I'm trying to improve. But you might find it different for yourself in terms of what your goals might be. But you can do this in a more concrete way if that's something that fits your style better. And then even for those of us that maybe are less inclined to do something more concrete like this, you can even have a very simple procedure, which would take you maybe a few seconds of starting off wherever you are, whether you have this sheet of paper or this diagram in front of you, with taking a deep breath as your first step. And then as your second step, just bringing to mind what you value, right? And it doesn't have to be words. It could be a picture of maybe people or things that you value. And then as the third step, compassionately accepting what's showing up. So whether it's an uncomfortable feeling, whether it's a pleasant feeling, just accepting what's showing up in the moment. And then looking to see if in the current moment, in that exact moment, as the fourth step, are we engaging in any unhelpful actions? And if possible, as our last step, our 5th step here, can we shift or commit to taking an action of what's important to us in this moment? And this is probably the version of this that I use the most often, especially if I'm pre-pandemic, if I was about to go into a school building and I knew it was going to be a rough day. Just taking 30 seconds to stop and walking through these 5 steps was enough of a reminder for myself of what I'm going to be doing as I move into the next space in my day, and what are some actions that I want to make sure I'm avoiding, what actions do I want to move towards, and also where am I currently in terms of my emotions before I actually move into that space. So different ways of actually doing the same activity, and everybody has a different way of doing it. Some people will do it once and then it's in their mind. Others will continue to do it on a piece of paper. You can do it with each other as a group, and I'll show you some examples of that. But the main piece here is that it's very much like mindfulness. So if you meditated before, I know we saw a lot of meditation and yoga. It's getting us to the same skill where we start to become better at noticing the present moment, of noticing both our actions as well as what's happening to us internally. And then noticing starts to give us that flexibility to be able to choose what we're going to do next in any situation. So Very, very quickly, and I want to make sure we get to questions. I'm going to fly through some examples of how we can do this in different contexts. And for schools, I always like to go through how we can do this ACT training for groups, where we focus not just on flexibility, but psychological safety. And it's the same exact activity in terms of the diagram. But you can see in the middle now it's us noticing. So it's not just as an individual, but what are we noticing as a group? And now we just change our questions to include the group. So for a school, we can ask ourselves, what do we value as a school? And I know even doing these activities, if we're thinking about, what are our values in terms of culture and diversity, this is a great way to open up the conversation of what that looks like for our schools. We can also ask ourselves as a group, what are some of the internal content and away moves we're taking, right? So we know if we work in a school long enough that there are certain things that we might be doing, we might be feeling, that are things that are commonly known to everybody, but can we recognize if we're getting stuck in that cycle? And then similarly to the individual version, what are some actions that we can be taking towards our shared values as a school? And again, doing this with a level of self-compassion, even as a group, recognizing that we're all likely to be struggling, especially if we've been struggling as a group. But how do we start to mindfully move towards the things that are going to help us in this situation? And it's very, very similar to the individual activity, but as I mentioned earlier, when we do this as an individual, we're trying to build our individual psychological flexibility in a mindful way. When we do this as a group, it requires us to have a certain level of psychological safety. So I know if I'm in a group and I don't feel 100% safe in sharing what are some things showing up inside of me, if I'm worried that someone's going to punish me for it, or people are going to not listen to me in that situation, it's going to make it very hard for me to share. So if we're facilitating this activity as a group, a lot of times I'll go through it as the individual version first. So we're starting to become more flexible, and then agreeing as a group that we want to work towards this psychological safety, so that we're open and we're willing to share, and we're able to look at ourselves as a group, and even recognizing that as any human group, we're going to be making away moves, whether it's internal or external. And the important piece is, can we bring ourselves to notice it long enough for us to commit ourselves to doing things that are going to move us towards our common values? So the task is very, very similar, but just is now getting comfortable with what's showing up inside of us in that group setting. I always like to put this up here in terms of a lot of schools that I work with. Oftentimes we think about how do we move towards more nurturing environment as opposed to a coercive environment. And we've all been in situations where we've been coerced in different ways, or been made to do things that we don't want to do. And we often engage the same thing with students. And again, this is a natural thing. We can't get through our world without having some level of coercion. But a lot of our schools that we work with oftentimes are trying to work towards more nurturing environments. And we can make that our goal if that's what our group value is, and try to figure out on a whole, how do we actually make our organization more nurturing? Another area I wanted to quickly cover was also ACT for children. So it's the same activity that we can do with our students, as well as maybe children that we have at home. And I always like to start off with us doing it first. And it's very much kind of a situation of putting your mask on first. And if you don't know how to do it for yourself, it's unlikely you'll know how to do it for the child next to you, or any individual next to you. But now that we've actually walked through it and did the activity, we can also look at some examples of how we would do this with kids. And I purposely put some examples here of younger children. If you're working with older, middle, high school, you can probably do the activity almost exactly the way we did it. But if you're working with elementary students, it might look a little bit different. So oftentimes I'll use graphics. So I have a heart, what are things that bring you joy, that you love doing? What do you want to do? What do you like? So just simplifying some of those questions. On the lower left side, I'll often put these monsters here, and I'll ask, what are some icky things that show up inside? We might sometimes draw out these monsters and label them anxiety or fear, just to give kids a little bit more concrete idea of their emotional literacy. And then we'll also ask them questions of what are some away moves. If you've ever done the PAX Good Behavior game, we give funny names to these away moves to make make sure the kids don't see it as a way that they're going to get in trouble for sharing away moves. So we'll give it a silly name like spleens. And we'll make jokes. We'll say, you know, everybody poops, everybody spleens. It's a normal part of life. We all make away moves. But how do we, again, bring it into the room where we're able to share this in a comfortable way? And on the other side, we might ask them what their toward moves are, how they're able to surf through their day. And in the good behavior game, oftentimes we'll call this PAX, which is Latin for peace. So what are some of their peaceful moves towards the things that they like and the things they want to move towards? And with kids, again, we'll use a lot more graphics, especially the younger the child is, and help them recognize that we want them to be whole with their experience. When they're flexible, they're able to take in all of their experiences, whether they're negative or even painful. And as you can see with the monster over here on the inflexibility side, is kind of scrunched up on the left side of our diagram where they might be stuck there and unable to move towards the things that are important to them. And when we do this in schools, it's always a little fun. Even at the elementary level, you start to see kids even use the language. I've been sitting in classrooms where kids are, you know, talking to each other and saying, "I'm noticing I'm making a lot of away moves today," and then they'll start actually having a conversation about, you know, how they can move towards what they want to do during their day. So it's a nice way to help kids also in a more concrete way start to build that flexibility. Sometimes I'll also embed this activity directly into other practices we have in our schools. So if we're doing classroom expectations and rules, as we often are with PBIS, we can have our classroom values. So we might work on this in the beginning of the year, and we can say, you know, how we're going to treat each other and come up with a short list of what our values or expectations are. And then also on the top over here, we can think about what are our rules of action, right? So what are the things that are going to move us towards what we value? So I just picked a fairly common one where we might say, you know, we're going to use a quiet raised hand to speak so we can hear everybody. So we're not speaking over each other. And we're going to notice when we're doing that. And we're going to maybe even, you know, recognize each other for taking those actions. I also use this activity oftentimes to build in my social emotional learning. So we might introduce the activity and do it with the students as an opening activity. And then afterwards, we might zoom in on one of the squares. So we might say, today we're going to focus on values. And we're going to really look at what's important to us in different situations. And there's all different types of activities we can do here. We can do a value sort where we give them cards with certain values on it, you know, friendship, loyalty, and we can have them sort based on priority, what's the most important value for them, and help them work through what that might be for them in their life as well. For the away, on the bottom for our away moves that might be internal, this is often a great time to build an emotional literacy piece of looking at what our different feelings might be like, what are some different thoughts we might be having. I know for young children, it's often very difficult for them to separate their thoughts and feelings. So it could be a great example of having them list out what's showing up inside for them and then helping them discriminate between what's a thought versus a feeling, which is itself going to help them become more mindful of what's actually showing up for them in the moment. As we move up into actions, this is where we can do more activities on our spleens or our yucky behavior, things that might be moving us away, and giving students strategies, coping strategies. How do I stop myself if I find myself in an action that I don't want to be taking? How do I take a break? How do I do a relaxation activity to stop myself? And then on the positive side, it might be more focused on goal setting, you know, strategies to help move towards the things that we want to move towards, self-monitoring, all the traditional strategies we might use to help kids better self-regulate towards their own goals. And then broadly, we can embed mindfulness exercises into any of these, where we either do formal mindfulness activities or other activities like the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 activity for our 5 senses we did earlier, as a way to help practice the noticing skill itself. I tend to stay away from formal meditation. Not that I have anything against it. I do it myself every day. But I often find that it's either hard for children or it works for some children, but not for everybody. So I try to usually pick an activity that's going to be, get at the skill of mindfulness, but not necessarily be something that everybody would not be comfortable doing. So whatever activity you pick that's going to help students be more mindful, we'll get at this point of getting better at noticing our own experiences. This activity can also be used oftentimes with perspective taking. So if we're using it with individuals, a lot of times this is just personal perspective taking. So getting to notice our internal experience versus our external experience. But we can do this socially as well. So I've had conflict resolution where if I'm working with a student, they might be describing the situation that got them in trouble or where they found themselves having a problem. So I had this particular student where he's describing to me his outside view where he was staring at a friend. And then he was describing his inside view where he's talking about how he wants to get his friend's attention and he's feeling bored and lonely in this situation. And now his friend, John, the only thing that he knows is his outside view because he doesn't know what John's inside view is. So he's describing what John was doing in that situation. So he's saying, John told me to stop staring and walked away. And this particular student that I used to work with was actually very bad at perspective taking across other individuals. So we would have him guess what the inside view of the other individual was. And it took us many, many sessions, but eventually he started to get better at trying to figure out what might be some feelings and thoughts that John might be having in that situation that explains his outside view. So eventually we came to something like, I don't feel comfortable when people stare at me. That might be a thought that John's having in this situation. And John might be feeling pretty anxious about this. So this can be used again as a way for building that perspective taking skill and other social skills to help kids recognize not only that they have the outside and inside view, but everybody has the outside inside view. And it can help us in our social interactions if we're able to notice that. And then usually for individual students, I think usually this is where it's a student that's having a little bit more struggle. Sometimes we'll give them self-monitoring where they actually have a sheet of paper and they might write down some of their core values. They might use the bottom left square as a thought emotion journal. And they might even do something like a tally on the top where they actually tally how many away or toward moves they're making. And then when they meet with us, they actually write down a percentage and then they review with us on what did they notice? Was it hard? Was it difficult? What can we do better next time that we're working on this? Okay, so that's actually everything that I had up to this point. I do want to stop for questions and thoughts or comments. But actually very quickly before I do that, I want to make sure I just point you to resources that we've shared with you and other resources that you can also have on this same topic. One of the ones that is part of your resource packet, and you can actually purchase these, are the Ack Matrix Cards. And these cards are related to the 4 squares that we were just working on, and each one has a fun picture on it and then also an activity on the back. So this is one of my particular favorite ones. It's called Catch and Release. And this is for the lower left corner, so things that are showing up inside of us that might move us away. And I use this oftentimes for thoughts that are very slippery, right? Or thoughts that might stick around too long, and things that will hook me into maybe a bad cycle that I'm trying to avoid. So this is a catch and release activity where I maybe catch myself having the thought. And once I notice that I'm having that thought, I release it, very much like I might do that to a fish. I've never fished before, so I'm assuming. But it's another fun way to help children as well as adults be able to practice the skills that we were just looking at on that diagram. And there in the cards, there's multiple activities for each one of the squares that you can do for yourself, as well as do it with your students. Another great resource out there that I personally use, especially in longer workshops around teacher stress, is this wonderful book on stress management for teachers. It's a much longer book, obviously, and then it has a lot of different activities and suggestions in there. But it's something that if you're able to, I would highly recommend it. It has a lot of wonderful suggestions. It has a wonderful multi-page list of all the fun things you can do. This is just wonderful, wonderful ideas, as well as other activities that can help you do mindfulness exercises and help you with difficult, stressful situations. So with that, I just wanted to leave you with a quote that I think fits our acceptance and commitment piece of, oops, went too far, of being kinder to yourself and really having that acceptance of the things that might be showing up, and then letting your kindness flood the world. So making sure that acceptance also leads to some level of commitment on the actions that we're going to take in the future. Okay, so now I'm gonna say thank you for everybody that was attending. I apologize if I missed anybody's comments, but I wanted to also open it up for any kind of questions or other comments that we might have.
Okay, Imad, our first question is, what is the typical number of responses you get when doing this with a student for each box?
So that's a wonderful question. If I'm doing it usually in a classroom setting, it's a lot more for as the kids get older. For the younger kids, I often have to start off with some suggestions of my own. But once they get going, it usually ends up in a situation where I run out of space. So even with younger children, I think once they get the idea of what's happening and they start to feel more comfortable, they'll share out a lot of ideas. Where I don't find that happening is if I'm working individually in counseling. And that oftentimes is a much more difficult process, especially if the individual is experiencing a lot more stress, maybe some mental health challenges, challenges with trauma. So in those situations, oftentimes you might get something as small as 1 or 2 or even nothing, right? They might say they're not noticing anything in that moment. So, yeah.
Okay, next question. What is the youngest you can do this activity with? Do you suggest doing this as a group with staff?
So in terms of the age, the youngest I've done it with is, I would probably say a 5-year-old, which is my own nephew. I've definitely done it at a very young age, but I think that's where as educators or as mental health professionals, we have to use our developmentally appropriate ways of getting at the activity. So depending on the age of the child, they might not be able to understand some parts of it. So I'll change it a lot depending on what's actually happening. So when I work with very, very young kids, I want to ask them really what's important to them. Sometimes I have them draw it out. So I work with my 5-year-old nephew, where we might be drawing out a burger, and they get to color it in, and that's their way of getting to relate to something that's important to them. And then in terms of the second question, in terms of groups, I personally love doing it as a group. I've done it a lot with either a classroom or a group of students, but also as groups of teachers. Or even working with whole schools. And I find that it's actually a really great way to start to enter into more difficult conversations and even having a formal way of bringing in difficult content that we might not normally be willing to share. So once we go through this activity, it starts to open up the door of us feeling more and more comfortable, more flexible with sharing uncomfortable experiences that we might be having.
So that leads us into our next question, Imad. What if performing this exercise triggers a student into reliving a traumatic experience?
Right. So I think a lot of times what we'll do is we'll make sure that if I'm doing this in a school, we'll have our counselors or other individuals that are that can provide mental health services aware that we're doing the activity, and if they have to, they can actually work with that student immediately if they need to. And what we look at it is that it's almost a, we want to do it in a safe way where if a student does bring up a situation that's very difficult for them, that the teachers have a way of helping the student be guided towards proper services. And this has actually happened to me in situations where it actually didn't turn out to be that serious, and other situations where it was. Most of the time that actually leads to being able to provide services for a student that we weren't necessarily aware of. We always also give students the option of not participating. So either they're going to have a sheet in front of them and they can actually do it privately, or they can participate publicly. And for the students that don't want to do it at all, we can even ask them to maybe put their head down or do another activity quietly. So we always make it voluntary. So it's not something that they would necessarily have to share with us if they don't necessarily want to.
And leading into another question about that, when a child is fixated on the emotion of jealousy, how do you get a child to move away from that emotion?
Right. So it would be hard to describe specifically, because I think jealousy would show up in different ways for students. The first thing that I would probably do is actually go through the activity a few times and try to see if we start to notice not just that the child's having the jealousy, but what are some actions, probably I'm guessing some away moves that jealousy might be leading into. And then trying to get the child to actually notice how that jealousy might be impacting their actions. So it might be, I imagine if they're jealous, it's probably maybe around an individual. So that individual might be very important to them. And it might be a matter of noticing that the jealousy leads to actions that don't help them move towards that individual. Depending on how serious it is, a lot of times we'll actually help students create a plan where they have more appropriate, more helpful and healthy ways of being with that individual without engaging in maybe in unhelpful actions through the jealousy.
All right, and 2 more questions, Imad. Someone is writing, this is really an excellent tool. Have you written more deeply about this? Is there a specific place I can go to read more about it?
Yes, and I believe we actually, so one, I should mention that this is not my tool. So both the therapy and the tool are not mine. I'm just using it from much more brilliant people. So it's coming from clinical psychology. And in our resource list, we actually have links to websites and books that are written on this strategy as well. And there's here in Jersey where I am, there's Phil Tenaglia, who actually has a website called The Matrix Goes to School. There's an Ack Matrix Academy. So there's a lot of resources online where you can learn this for free and actually even practice with other individuals. I mentioned Phil because he does a lot of work in schools. So a lot of his specific examples are going to be things that teachers are doing and you can do with your students. So there's definitely a lot out there on there. There's books you can get on Amazon for it, but also a lot of free resources.
Imad, they're asking you to repeat the websites again that you just mentioned.
Oh, sure. Let me see if I can actually type it here too. So if you Google Matrix Goes to School, that's it'll get you to Phil Tenaglia's website. There's also the Ack Matrix Academy. So ACT, Matrix Academy.
Okay. And then a question, I'd love to take this back as a PD for teachers. Any recommendations for protecting psychological safety for that process? Perhaps just volunteer basis participation, maybe?
So definitely, I think it's something that I would probably recommend as you do it. One, explaining that, this is an activity where you might be sharing things that might be uncomfortable or things that you might not feel comfortable doing. I always, again, like to give the options of saying that, you can not participate at all, participate privately, or participate as a group as you feel comfortable. But what I'll do is I'll also have them do the individual version first before they go into it as a whole group. So even if they're not feeling as flexible originally before we start the group activity, the initial sorting of our experiences may help them open up to wanting to work with the group. So I think giving the voluntary nature of it, and then also giving them time to practice as an individual before they move to a group is a good way to approach it. And there are situations, unfortunately, where if the group as a whole, or if there's enough people in the group that don't feel comfortable moving forward, we wouldn't move forward with the activity. So sometimes in those situations, we have to find other ways to do it. But generally, what I find in my own experience is that if we are able to bring in enough flexibility in the room, it becomes a jumping off board into going into the psychological safety piece as well.
And then we just have one of our participants is wondering what app you use to link your iPad to the screen, because they can see that as a great way to help shy kids participate when using a chat box.
Definitely. So I wrote it in there too, but so on the iPad, it's an app called Notability. And it's just a writing app. And then I'm using it through Zoom. So I just shared my iPad screen and then I opened up the Notability app.
I think that answers all of our questions, unless any of our participants have any additional questions for Imad.
And as we're looking for those, I'll just mention that if you go to even this site over here, it's for the Matrix Cards, but the site itself has one of the people that helped create the Ack Matrix, Benjamin, and he has a wonderful list of resources, and he also does online trainings and has videos of how you can do the Ack Matrix. So, notice that a lot of the people actually do it slightly different from the way we did it right now. So you can even go to this website here and look at some resources. And if you did have any other additional questions, my email is up here too. I'd be happy to answer questions or share any additional resources that would be helpful.
Does So Anne, I think it's back to you.
Excellent. So thank you, Imad, for a very wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it. Appreciate all this good work. And I think two observations. One, really interesting application of the ACT approach. I haven't seen that before, so I think it's really wonderful. And number two, just an observation that a lot of the educators here quickly, I noticed, shifted to how can we use this with the kids. So just an observation that I think a reminder how important it is to make sure to use it for ourselves and to make sure that we take care of ourselves and do the work for ourselves so that we're able to be there in the best way possible. So even in the self-care presentation, everybody's thinking about how to take care of other folks. So I appreciate the spirit of that. It's really beautiful, but I think just we need to also do our own self-care.
And sometimes I think in the situation with educators and I think mental health professionals, oftentimes I think we forget how much even taking care of others helps us reconnect with the values of our compassion and connectedness with students too. So I think it can be a mutually beneficial activity.
Absolutely, or doing it all together, like you were mentioning. I think we can take care of ourselves and help others take care of themselves too. So it's really wonderful. So thank you so much, Imad, and thank you to all of our participants. We really appreciate it. Again, just a last minute reminder, we'd love for you to complete the very brief survey. Other than that, we will say goodbye for